سأذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا، سنذهب إلى سوريا.
هذا النظام لن يبقى في الشعب صالحا.
Good afternoon on this Thursday, August 22nd. I'm Yumna Naufal and these are today's headlines. International officials voiced their appall at the chemical attack in Syria. Washington, D.C.-based analyst Firas Maksad comments. Masked gunmen shoot dead a Hezbollah supporter and 2 other men, including a member of the security forces in Tripoli. And Egypt's former President Hosni Mubarak is to be placed under house arrest after a court orders his release. The Syrian opposition claims that President Bashar al-Assad's regime has killed more than 1,300 people in an apparent gas attack on rebel-held parts of eastern Damascus. This is believed to be the worst known use of chemical weapons since Saddam Hussein gassed thousands of Kurds in the Iraqi town of Halabja in 1988. Syrian Information Minister Omran Zawabi called the allegations of chemical attacks illogical and accused opposition forces of fabricating lies against Assad's government. Syria's opposition is demanding that the United Nations chemical weapons inspectors immediately investigate the rebel-held region hit by an alleged chemical weapons attack that has killed hundreds of people a day earlier. In Paris, French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said the international community needed to respond with force if the allegations that the Syrian government was responsible for the attack on civilians proved true, although there was no mention of sending troops on the ground. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's forces have continued a heavy bombardment of the ring of rebel-held suburbs around the capital, known as the Ghouta region, which activists say will further hinder UN investigators from entering the area. The Security Council did not explicitly demand a UN investigation of the incident, although it said clarity was needed and welcomed UN Chief Ban Ki-moon's calls for a prompt investigation by the inspection team.
I wouldn't want to speculate on what may or may not have happened. Fortunately, we have credible, professional investigators with the United Nations on the ground in Syria right now. Let's give them the opportunity to take a look at what happened. Let's give them the opportunity to interview witnesses. Let's give them the opportunity to collect some physical evidence. And then we can reach a conclusion about what exactly happened there. But suffice it to say, though, that the use of chemical weapons is something that the United States finds totally deplorable and completely unacceptable. And those who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons, if it's determined that that's what happened, will be held accountable.
Washington, D.C.-based political consultant and Middle East analyst Firas Maksad is in our studios today. Welcome, Firas. Who do you think is responsible for this heinous crime?
Well, Yumna, I mean, that is a question that's out there. In my mind, there's very little doubt that the Syrian regime should bear the brunt of the responsibility. It's true that outside players might have be involved, or at least some of the propaganda outlets associated with it.
Who do you mean by outside players?
I mean, there are all kinds of allegations being put out there by those who are affiliated with the Assad regime. But the truth really is that given the amount of casualties that we've witnessed, over 1,000, that the dispersal mechanisms that are available are only available, that are required, are only available to regime forces. So I'm really doubtful that there could be a third party that's involved here.
Okay, but why would the Assad regime time a chemical attack on the same day that UN inspectors arrived to investigate whether or not the government is using chemical weapons in the first place?
I think the Assad regime probably carried out these operations knowing that many like you are going to be asking that question. Could it be possible that they would use chemical weapons on the eve of the arrival of the UN inspector? I mean, let's remember, this is a regime that knew President Obama drew a very clear red line against the use of chemical weapons. They crossed that line. They tested the will of the United States and the will of the international community. They understood that there is little in terms of a price that they would have to pay, and they are again testing the will of the international community. And that's why it's important that this time there'd be a very clear price that the regime would have to pay.
Okay, so what is the clear response that you're speaking about?
Well,
because as you said, the Obama administration had mentioned a red line, and if this is the red line, and we're hoping that it is what they will consider a red line, what is the correct response that we can expect from the United States now?
The truth, Yumna, is that Washington, D.C. and President Obama himself has very little interest in getting himself involved in Syria. And therefore, what we heard from the spokesman is that there needs to be investigation. We need to know exactly what happened. But should we get to a point where the public outcry, the media coverage puts enough pressure on the White House to finally act, there are a list of options that the commander of the U.S. Army has put forward to the White House in terms of what could be possible. I think the most logical, what's on top of that list, is perhaps standoff attacks using cruise missiles against specific units in the Syrian army that are viewed as being complicit in the use of chemical weapons.
Many rebels and activists in the opposition area say they have lost interest in UN investigations, and they don't expect any help from Western powers anymore because this has been going for, we're closing in on 3 years in March. Right. Do you think rebels should take matters into their own hands?
I'm not too sure what rebels can do. They do have growing military capability, but that's still fairly limited. It is especially limited as it relates to chemical warfare. I really do think that the responsibility when we talk about these kinds of crimes at that level, atrocities that, as you mentioned, I mean, Saddam Hussein in Halabja, there's a role there for the international community to step in and basically take things into its own hand, especially the United States, who, I mean, for better or worse, today is the leading global power, and people look at it in order to enforce international legitimacy. The United Nations Security Council is, of course, a good starting point, but should that...
Right, but this is what I want to... Excuse me for interrupting you here. The United Nations Security Council, for 2 years and 8 months that the Syrian war has started and that the protests have turned violent, has been condemning Assad. There have been 2 Geneva conferences, and there have been so many different condemnations and statements sent, but nothing really done. The United States was even reluctant to arm the rebels because they said they may be affiliates of Al-Qaeda, and they weren't really sure about that. So it's all talk. Isn't that what it seems like until now?
At the UN Security Council, I think I will agree with you. I mean, with the Russian and possibly Chinese veto, there's very little chance that we're going to get anything out of the Security Council. What we need here is a coalition of the willing, both Arab and Western. The French Foreign Minister has already put out a statement saying that should the UN Security Council prove to be in deadlock, other options need to be considered. That is a meaningful statement. Hopefully it would not just stay in terms of words or ink on paper, that there'd be some action to follow up with that. But again, I go back to the point that I made earlier. There is very little Western and specifically American appetite for getting involved in Syria. And that's because nobody sees what the end game is, and because from a Western perspective, there are no viable, positive scenarios that would serve their interest. And here is perhaps the entryway to talk about the rebels. And the disarray, 2.5 years into the Syrian conflict, these rebel forces are still very much infiltrated by jihadis, Al-Qaeda type, especially up north when we talk about, Raqqa and Halab, Aleppo, and Idlib province. Perhaps on the southern front, things are a bit more in control. There's, a bit more unity of command and control there, and something positive can be done to put pressure on Damascus.
So why would the United States support the rebels if they do believe that if the opposition would win and Assad would fall, it would not serve U.S. interests? As General Martin Dempsey, the highest-ranking military officer, wrote, that it would not, the United States would not intervene in the Syrian conflict because it does not believe anti-Assad rebels would support American interests.
Lack of U.S. and Western leadership on Syria allows for there to be a void which radical forces, Al-Qaeda plus, will then seek to dominate and control. That's what has happened in northern Syria for the past 2.5 years. What the international community, led by the United States, needs to do is to take the lead in building rebel forces that are moderate, that have command and control hierarchy, and that are accountable. We have elements of that with the Free Syrian Army, the Supreme Military Council under the control of General Idris. That needs to be supported, trained, and armed under the supervision of a coalition of the willing. Otherwise, we risk losing Syria on one hand to Iran and Hezbollah, and on the other hand to Al-Qaeda and jihadis.
Should Assad fall, is what you're trying to say?
Even should the conflict continue to drag on, which in all cases, on the path that we're on, it will, as General Dempsey pointed out, for 5, possibly 10 years.
General Dempsey pointed out that this could last another 5 and 10 years, which brings me to the repercussions that this is going to have on Lebanon and the region as a whole. Can you comment on that? If the conflict were to drag on for another 5 years, seeing the amount of casualties and damage it has done in just 2.5 years?
I mean, it would be an absolute travesty for the region. What we're really talking about here in Lebanon's environment in Syria, I mean, when we talk about Lebanon, we really are talking about Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, because the political and social fabric of all these countries, the broader Levant, are very interrelated. So what we're really looking into here, what we're peering into, is a Syria that's coming apart. We're talking about continued fragmentation for years to come. Now, surprisingly, perhaps for many analysts, Lebanon has been able to withstand that. And it's been able to withstand that because of a coalition of both regional and international actors who did not want to rock the boat and wanted to dissociate Lebanon from what's going on in Syria.
But a complete dissociation, as we have seen, is not really possible.
I mean, this is operating in shades of gray. There's no clear white and black here. But what is most worrying, that after Hezbollah's campaign, an adventure in Al-Qusayr, and in their open entry into Syria, that consensus seems to be coming apart. And that's when we start seeing attacks in Dahi, the first attack, the second attack. I worry that as things move forward in the coming years, that consensus to keep Lebanon out of Syria is going to come apart too. And I worry about Lebanon, not in terms of a civil war, but in terms of a campaign of violence that might be with us for years to come.
Mr. Maksad, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you again here in our studios. That was Washington, D.C.-based political consultant and Middle East analyst Firas Maksad talking about the chemical weapon attack in Syria. Coming up next, Human Rights Watch urges Egyptian authorities to protect churches and Christian homes from attacks. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Masked gunmen shot dead a Hezbollah supporter and 2 other men, including a member of the security forces in the northern city of Tripoli. Masked men on motorbikes shot dead Hassan al-Moudi, a security official, and a 3rd man who happened to be at the scene, according to an official. Moudi was a known supporter of Hezbollah and has been target of previous assassination attempts. He headed an armed group in a northern city which last year clashed with militiamen opposed to Hezbollah and Assad's regime. Moudi, who was in his 40s, and the 2 other men were standing at the entrance to his home when the gunman drove up and shot them. And we know that Tripoli has seen frequent Syria-related violence over the past 2 years, including waves of deadly clashes. In other local news, Hezbollah slams critics of their group's decision to step up security measures in Beirut's southern suburbs following a recent car bombing that killed 24 people last week. I am surprised with those denouncing Hezbollah's security measures. MP Ali Muqdad, a member of the Loyalty to the Resistance parliamentary bloc, said Hezbollah erected checkpoints and its members inspected cars entering neighborhoods. Muqdad says that every Lebanese, not just Hezbollah or security institutions, should act as guards to protect the country. Egypt's interim prime minister's office says former President Hosni Mubarak will be placed under house arrest following a court ruling stating he could be released from prison pending further investigation into corruption charges against him. The former president, who was toppled in a 2011 uprising, has been told he can prepare for future court appearances from home. Citing a security source, the state news agency said Mubarak would likely be transported to one of the state's vital installations or one of 2 military hospitals where he will be guarded under heavy security. And Egyptian authorities must protect churches and Christian homes and businesses from attack, and Islamists must stop inciting sectarian violence, according to Human Rights Watch. The group says it documented attacks on 42 churches and dozens of Christian institutions, schools and homes, as well as Christian-owned businesses across the country. It says at least 4 people were reported killed in sectarian violence, 3 Christians and 1 Muslim. Attacks on Egypt's Christian minority have escalated since the July 3rd ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi. Human Rights Watch says authorities have failed to protect Christians from attacks and that Islamists, including Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, has failed to properly condemn the violence and prevent future attacks. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Let me remind you of our headlines. International officials voiced their appalling at the chemical attack in Syria. Washington, D.C.-based analyst Firas Maksad was here to comment. Masked gunmen shoot dead a Hezbollah supporter and 2 other men, including a member of the security forces in Tripoli. And Egypt's former president Hosni Mubarak is to be placed under house arrest after a court orders his release. Those are your Thursday headlines live on Future Television in Beirut. I'm Yumna Naufal. Linda Tamim will be back tomorrow at 4:20 for all the latest. Be safe.
أن أذهب أنا وكل حزب الله إلى سوريا سنذهب إلى سوريا.
هذا النظام لن يبقى في الشارع صالحا.